Welcome to the Rethinking Europe podcast. I'm your host, Aybars Öztuna, Global Partnerships and Fundraising Lead at the European Integration Group. Today, we are joined by a guest, Halit Jakub Karakuş. I know Halit from his work within European Democrat students, but his experience goes well beyond that. Halit currently serves as a representative to the European Union at a human rights NGO, the international secretary of the Young Democrats in Poland. It's called Młodzi Demokracji, young European ambassador within EU Neighbors East, and is also a member of the events and partnerships team at EU and U. Halit is completing his bachelor's degree in sociology and policy at Université Libre de Bruxelles, a background that strongly informs his analytical approach to European affairs. Halit, welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much for your invite. I'm very happy to be here. Yeah.
All right, let's get started with the first question then. So, your academic background is in sociology and policy. How does a sociological lens change the way we should understand EU decision making, particularly beyond formal institutions and treaties?
Well, it's an interesting question. As in Brussels, most people hold a law degree, and it's actually funny because it isn't quite common to have like a sociology degree, anything that's not law related. So to start, EU politics aren't only treaties and the institutions, even though they are very important, obviously, but there's also a social aspect of this. There are norms, like some networks. There's routines in every decision that is done in Brussels, as well. I mean, when we say routines in sociology, we call it habitus, habitus, Pierre Bourdieu thing, and power relations. All of this like constituting to a somewhat sociological aspect of decision making. So additionally, like the vast amount of socialization that's happening within all of these institutions between the people is also quite important, because like the socialization, which is another sociological concept, I'm gonna throw in some sociological concepts here, hopefully that's not a problem. Like the socialization in the bubble itself has a big impact on like everything that is happening here, everything that is decided here. People that socialize here with each other create an understanding of a common sense that can be seen differently in other parts of the EU. Thus, like socialization itself has a giant impact both on decision making, but also like final outcomes. Another like important part of sociology, as I mentioned before, is habitus. So it's like routines. Whenever there's a decision made, people have a routine of doing it in process. There's a clear decision-making way of doing stuff. Like there's a whole tree of deciding if the council accepts it, if the parliament accepts it, the changes, the amendments, whatever. It's a whole routine. It's a whole habitus that has been created since the Lisbon Treaty, since the Maastricht Treaty, whatsoever. So it's a whole big thing that's like important. And lastly, like another important part of sociology is data. I believe that the European Union is very good in this aspect, especially with Eurostat. It is a statistical institute in I think it's in Luxembourg, I'm not sure. Is it in Luxembourg or here? I think it's Luxembourg. So Eurostat, what it does is gathers enormous amounts of data, and this data helps both like policy and decision making, helps every institution like the commission, the parliament, the council, and Eurostat itself is like very sophisticated in this. How is data connected to sociology? Because most of sociological research is done also in like quantitative and qualitative analysis, where we just ask people their opinions. We make numbers. If they said yes, we put a 1. If they said no, we put a 0, and then we have a giant Excel spreadsheets with like millions of rows.
Yes.
Yeah, but going back on the so-called like beyond formal, I would also consider all the advisors, lobbyists, civil servants. I think there's like many of like Brussels is the second biggest lobbying capital in the world after Washington. And like these people, these groups of people, like civil groups, civil society, whatever, they also often shape outcomes more than commissioners on camera or ministers. So yeah, I think that answers a bit the question.
So, from your experience across multiple youth organizations, do you see them as a genuine agenda setters within the EU ecosystem, or are they still largely symbolic extensions of institutional politics?
Well, it's a yes and no question because most of the time the youth is represented by interest groups, lobbies in a constructive and let's call it in a non-disruptive discourse. Like most prominent, in my opinion, like the most popular, in my opinion, from these lobbies is the European Youth Forum. They are very established within the EU framework, and people like sometimes people think that they're part of the youth. That's how they are recognized. However, it is not the case. The youth organizations are mostly agenda influencers. Like they're not setting the agenda like some other lobbies do, but they're like influencing the agenda. Or they're saying, oh, we want this, we want that, but they're not really setting it. And even though we have seen a giant progress since the Juncker Commission before Ursula von der Leyen, there's still stuff to do. The Commission is meeting right now. When I'm talking about the European Youth Forum and other lobbies, the Commission is meeting with youth groups regularly, gathering their perspectives and recommendations. And yes, so does the European Parliament, obviously. MEPs meet up with young representatives in their home countries during probably like green weeks or whatever. And yeah, I mean, the youth is quite strong. It's obviously getting stronger, but it is not still on the same level as the industrial, chemical, and other powerful lobbies that are like that strongly change the Commission's agenda, like from regulation, which was the agenda of the Commission a while back, to now, like it's very focused on simplification, cutting red tape, and now there was the voting of omnibus in December. So it really shows how the agenda is changing. So lately, the College of Commissioners, all of them, but like the key ones, met with industry leaders from the sectors I just mentioned. I think it was in Antwerp, and it was like a industry summit. Here an example of like practically direct agenda sending where these people have a possibility to impact the works of the EU. Well, concluding, it's better than it was like 10 years ago. There is a lot of dialogue, but it still isn't ideal nor perfect.
Would you argue that the EU is facing a crisis of input legitimacy, output legitimacy, or something more structural, perhaps a mismatch between a governance scale and democratic expectation?
Well, I would argue that the EU is facing something more structural than simply a crisis of input or output legitimacy. It's not just about like insufficient citizen participation, because we can see how many people voted during the European Parliament elections. For example, in countries like Belgium, the voting number is very high because voting here is mandatory. But in some countries, the voting didn't even come by like 50%. So it's crazy. But not only like I think the deeper issue is a mismatch between the scale of governance and the scale of democratic expectation. Citizens like often feel distant from EU decision making. Representation is like for them indirect because they choose their MEPs, but they don't choose the Commission directly. The MEPs that they have chosen choose the Commission, and as we know, the Commission is proposing laws. So yeah, representation, as I said, is like indirect for some people, and it is also like complex. Understanding how the EU works is a big problem itself, like in explaining people. I remember multiple times I had to explain to my family, and it wasn't on the first time that they got it, maybe in the like third time. So problem is not the absence of channels, but like the weakness of identifying this stuff. However, on the output side, the EU has delivered like in many domains, from market integration to regulatory standards, like even like managing crisis. For example, there were floods in Poland, my home country, and not only in Poland, also in Spain and Portugal and other countries too, in France too, and the EU quickly got like a package of like to save this, right, to save the infrastructure, to help the people out. And we as normal citizens, we're so used to the Schengen area, we're so used to like the freedoms that the EU gives, that we're slowly forgetting them and how privileged in reality we are. But however, like even if all of these privileges and all of these good sides are fear. They're common. The benefits are sometimes uneven, and successes are often like invisible. We don't see them. It's sometimes people just make fun. Oh, what did the EU do? They just change the caps on the water bottles. Well, in reality, EU did a lot of more than this, and that's the thing. It's just not evident. It's invisible. We just don't see it that much. And when policies actually do work, people think that it's normal, that it's administrative. There's actually a bunch of work put into it. But I think to like finish off, the core challenges like structural. The EU governs at a supranational level, while democratic expectations remain largely national. Citizens like expect responsiveness, clarity, and like maybe even like accountability to what they associate with national governments. So the thing is, people don't distinguish the capacity of the European Union with the capacity of their national governments. They think that some stuff that the EU can do, their national governments, like the stuff that the EU can do, they're mismatching with the stuff that the national governments can do. Because the EU has some power, has a lot of power, but not all. In many areas, it's the national governments that decide. So yeah, I think we have to like people have to learn or understand the EU, which is complex by itself to like understand both of these like input output legitimacies. Like so,
You have worked close to EU institutions. How real is the so-called Brussels bubble, and what mechanisms exist to prevent policy detachment from European societies? Also, you mentioned the Eurostat, which is, I think, in Luxembourg. So,
yeah.
both in this spectrum, how do you see what mechanisms exist to prevent policy detachment from European society?
So starting with the Brussels bubble question, and yeah, it's very real. Just like if you're ever in Brussels, just walk from the Schumann roundabout till the Brucker. So it's like a giant street with shops. You will see how realistic it is, how like the area changes, how the people in the area change, and how the language is spoken in the area change even more. I think the average like worker in the EU bubble is someone around their like 40s, as I said before, after a law degree, and it's presumably a white male. Why am I saying this? Because what makes the bubble truly a bubble are the shared social circles, languages that are spoken like in Brussels right now. I think there's like three languages that are like key, and people will laugh at this. English, obviously, everybody speaks English. French, obviously, because like the Bruxelles Federation, and Italian. There are so many Italians in the city that Italian, I think, I'm hearing it sometimes more often than English or French itself. But it's not a problem. There's just a lot of Italian civil servants here, and like going back like these career paths and also academic background. That's what I said, like most of the people have a law degree, so they have something to like relate to, which only reinforces the people in the bubble. Yes, detachment does exist on some levels, but to combat this there is always ongoing like consultation, civil society input or recommendations, and mostly like most importantly, as I said before, the MEPs are like the 720 MEPs voted like by the people. They're chosen by the people, which itself speaking for these MEPs to get into power, they most of the time have to speak with their people, have to exchange views, and have to be connected with their citizens to not be detached. Obviously, their APAs, which are accredited parliamentary assistants, share the workload, and they also meet up with all of these societies, all of these, let's call it, interest groups, citizens, civilians, whatever you call it. They also do this because I worked with a couple of APAs, very cool people to work with, and they say, yeah, we just met up with like school children. They explained us their worries. So yeah, detachment does exist, but I don't believe it is like such a big problem because it's combated. It's openly combated. There's the consultations. There's talking with people. There's obviously MEPs, the good ones, the ones that are, that work, because some of them just go home and meet up with like people in their local communities and actually discuss these problems. So yeah.
As a social media manager in a parliamentary setting, do you think digital political communication in Europe is becoming more deliberative or simply more performative?
Honestly, it's really performative because there's a shift like on the institutional, like if you open right now like the European Commission Instagram page or TikTok page or even the European Parliament, Now, when they're showcasing important changes, policies, or even like events, whatever, now they're using the young people, like people that we can actually get relate to. It's young interns, it's young people, it's people below their 30s. And it's very fun to watch these videos. They're very cool. Before it used to be politicians, civil servants, like people that are very bad in this. However, there's a change obviously in the people that present this, but they're still talking in a bureaucratic way, bureaucratic tone. And frankly, people may listen to this, but like, do they get it? It's another thing. It is mostly performative, as I said, which is totally fine because let's be honest, the algorithm, like on X, on TikTok, on Instagram, focuses on like creativity, clarity, emotions, most importantly, and some sort of visibility, than actually giving valuable information. That's why we have so many dumb stuff on the internet than actually informative stuff. Here come influencers, actually, like people that work in the Brussels bubble. It's a new trend that's coming in the last 2-3 years, that people that are actually now working in institutions or other organizations in the EU bubble are becoming the new face of the EU. It has been a new trend of like EU influencers that simplify this complex EU issues to make a larger public understand. One of them, I don't remember which one, exactly said that they do this because they truly believe in the European project. So imagine that people understand more people that make content in their free time than the people that make this content in the Commission of Parliament. The way that people need explanation nowadays is very quick, understandable, and clarity. Just to finish on a like personal anecdote to this, honestly, one of my friends during New Year's Eve, we were talking obviously on different topics. And my friend Olaf told me that we were like discussing political issues, stuff like this. And one of the clearer problems of the EU is messaging and transmitting the message. I think this is in all of the governments, but as the EU is such a big project and we're trying to people, especially young people, to believe in this, this is the problem right now. Like messaging, transmitting the message, and making people understand the message. I'm going to be frank, it is quite hard to explain these issues without over explaining some stuff. I personally run an Instagram page. It's not the best. I just do some content for fun. It is complex stuff. Trying to explain it in an easy way is even harder.
So you operate across national, organizational, and linguistic boundaries. Do you believe a genuinely European political identity is emerging among young elites, or are national frames still dominant?
That's a hard question, and I will use like we call it a scary word in Brussels, the word. So a European identity is emerging prominently with the Young European Federalists. It's a organization that's really getting some push right now. They're even like a lobby in the parliament, and they can lobby the MEPs too for a more federalized Europe. It doesn't matter. These young European federalists or other people that have their ideas in the federalist narrative are layering the European identity on top of the national ones. And from what I observed, people that call themselves like the European first, they when they you ask them where are you from, they say, oh, I'm European, right? So these are mostly people that have traveled a lot, know a couple of languages, and are interested in politics. There are more people than this in every day. However, like national frames still dominate when like stuff becomes in concrete with the EU, or like stakes become high. In my opinion, this is something that is emerging, not everywhere, not in every country, not in every union country, but mostly in the richer areas with people that actually have access to knowledge, have sort of a privilege. However, in most of the EU, we can even see it in the youth voting charts that from 18 to 35, most people voted in Poland. I'm talking about Poland right now, on the right wing or the far right wing parties, thus showing that they're very, very much more in a like nationalistic frames. Are still like these frames are still dominant. So it is emerging, but the national frames are still strong.
How do youth-led organizations reconcile the EU's push for strategic autonomy with the normative commitment to multilateralism and openness.
So youth-led organizations generally try or are trying to reconcile strategic autonomy and multilateralism by like reframing autonomy not as a isolation, but it's like capacity building thingy. The emphasis is on resilience, diversification of supply chains, and the ability to act independently when necessary while remaining embedded in rule-based international cooperation. There's an underlying tension, particularly in areas like defense and the industry policy, where autonomy can clash with openness. Youth organizations often manage this by like using normative language, presenting the strategic autonomy to protect multilateralism rather than like replace it. So in practice, this reconciliation is more coherent at the level of discourse than like the level of policy, and it reflects an attempt to align geopolitical realism with the EU self-image as a like an international cooperative actor. I didn't answer my best here, but it is a very complex question. Actually, I could talk about this for hours, but it is a very complex question, I think.
In your view, Halit, is access to EU policymaking becoming more inclusive through civil society or more exclusive through professionalized lobbying and technocracy?
So, civil society itself, if you're registered in the transparency register, you're also a lobby itself. You can do the same stuff as the technocratic, like the professionalized lobbying is doing. So, enter the parliament, meet with the MEP, meet with their APA, so the assistant, and talk with them. Give them your amendments, give them your worries, expectations, whatever. So, it can be on the same level. However, it is formally just more inclusive and substantially more exclusive. Let's pick an example. The Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, lately she met up with more industry leaders. And when I say industry leaders, I obviously mean like CEOs, lobbyists, to discuss like the problems of the EU with them rather like with civil society. Me myself, I'm still a student. I have university twice a week, and the other 3 times a week I work, and the evenings I do my other stuff. And when I say I work as the lobbyist. And as I said, it requires time, resources, expertise, and actually the will to do it, because most civil society you're not paid, and if you're paid, it's a very good civil society, stick to it. But professional lobbying has comparative advantages. They're backed by corporations, businesses, and actually it has some capital to make this lobbying easier, stronger, and more decisive. So technocracy itself filters like participation for technical competence, but end result to like conclude there is participation of the civil society, as I said, but it is not with equal influence. Most MEPs, most commissioners, and all of this are meeting more with, let's say, the chemical lobby, the industrial, automotive, pharmaceutical, medical lobbies than of like civil society. And nowadays it's understandable. I mean, it's obviously not a good thing for civil society, but it's understandable because the Commission's agenda is right now cutting red tape, competitiveness, simplification, all of this. So yeah.
Looking ahead 10 or 15 years, do you expect today's youth political movements to transform EU governance or to be absorbed and neutralized by existing institutional structures?
So definitely, as I said, the youth is very active. They're now openly influencing the agenda. And I hope to see in the future the youth, so us in our, I don't know, like you said, 10 years, I'm gonna be 30 something, like the youth setting the agenda, not only influencing it, but actually like setting it. With all these initiatives, ideas, events, like NGOs, groups of people, with everything, I hope the youth, and I believe that the youth has an easier access to learn about politics and access politics than ever before. Like imagine in the past, it was mostly people coming from very, let's say, sophisticated or rather rich backgrounds that could actually do something with politics. Nowadays, it's like everybody has the possibility to go to, I don't know, meet up with an MEP. Obviously, during some events, it's not like a common thing. But I believe right now it's more accessible, which itself pushes in a narrative that in 10 or 15 years, the youth political movements will transform, as we said, the EU governance. And let's be honest, I hope they do, because as I said in the previous questions, the EU needs some reforms, especially with transmitting the message and making people understand. And hopefully the youth introduces them. Hopefully it doesn't get absorbed by and neutralized by like institutional structures. Like people forget what they were fighting for or working for, and I hope that the youth actually will have in the future a big impact on EU governance. However, I believe I have an example that's quite recent. I'm not gonna name it because I don't want to do a negative PR. There was a launch of a youth lobby, let's call it as what it was, and it seemed very incompetent and no agenda. They didn't know what they were fighting for. They didn't say what they want to change. Nothing. In reality, it was like a big event. Sadly, no drinks. Big event, and yeah, it seemed very incompetent. And I talked with other colleagues that were at the event, and they said the same stuff. So going back and concluding, it is how we do our like youth political movements, like all of these initiatives that the youth is doing, that will decide if we're like absorbed by the institutions or actually we're trying to change the institutions and hopefully succeed.
So, given the current geopolitical, security, and normative environment, do you think Turkey-EU relations should still be conceptualized through the lens of accession, or is it time to openly articulate a new post-accession strategic framework?
This is a problematic question, but honestly, the idea of Turkey accessing the EU no longer reflects any political reality, especially with the recent events. It is quite problematic. I could give you the Copenhagen criteria that is like the criteria that every country has to pass to access the European Union,
Mhm.
but we could talk about this for hours and all the stuff that Turkey doesn't respect, doesn't accept, and doesn't like comply with. But people just can read the latest, I think it was the Commission of Parliament report, Turkey, that was published a while back, meaning in these couple months. However, I have a story that exactly shows what we see the relations with Turkey here in Brussels. There was a Euronews event called the EU Enlargement Summit, and as the name indicates, it's an enlargement summit. It's about countries getting into the EU. Turkey wasn't invited. The head of Turkey, or like the leader of Turkey, wasn't invited. There was Maya Sandu, there was Zelensky, there was a bunch of other leaders in Albania, Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro. All these countries were there, and they were actually talking quite openly about accessing and joining the EU. Montenegro, I think, is the closest to joining, and hopefully they will join 2028. There was this thing that the Euronews organized, which is very cool, by the way. It's called The Ring, and they're bringing two MEPs from different political groups to discuss and even fight some open questions. So there was a bunch of questions, and one of the MEPs was from my party, my group in the European Parliament, Mr. David McAllister from Germany, and the other was on the left, a Belgian MEP, a male with a beard. He's very strong in his beliefs. I don't agree with him on some stuff, but he's very strong and believing in his stuff. So there was a bunch of questions, etc., etc. And at the end, they said, "Do you think Turkey has a chance to join the EU?" Both of them, and keep in mind, the EPP is a center-right Christian Democrat party, and the left is very, some of the MEPs are far left. The left is very far left in the European Parliament, because the left itself is a group. And both of them simultaneously said, no, there's no way Turkey is right now joining. I'm very negative here, hopefully not a problem for your listeners. So to conclude, like a post-accession strategic partnership or framework is necessary to have closer relations with Turkey, because it is very important, I believe, to have relations, or at least like strong diplomatic ties with a country as Turkey that sits in such a strategic position without making an illusion of like accession. The cooperation, I believe, should like focus definitely on security, because Turkey has great technologies, especially your Bayraktar drones. A very good thing we could use it here. Trade, that's why I'm talking about that. Safe migration and regional stability. I believe such dialogue would benefit everybody without like a cover up about it being towards accession like in the future. So yeah, right now Turkey isn't like complying with most of the Copenhagen criteria. Thus, I think that the relation should change from accession to, as you said, post-accession strategic framework, right? So it should more focus on a partnership rather than letting Turkey enter the EU. The question itself is, do Turkish people want to enter the European Union? That's another thing. So that's a question to answer by the Turkish population.
But that's a great way to end. Well, thank you very much, Halit. It's been a very nice discussion and learned a lot from your perspectives and expertise. And
thank you very much for inviting me. Hopefully I didn't bore your listeners because I talk a lot. But yeah, thank you for the interesting questions. Some of them hard, some of them are very interesting. So yeah, thank you for the invite.
thanks.